For decades, the Boeing 737 was known as one of the most trusted aircraft ever built. It was a staple of fleets across the globe, quietly moving millions of passengers every single day. But when Boeing introduced its newest variant, the 737 MAX, in 2017, something caught the attention of experienced pilots. The aircraft had a subtle but noticeable tendency for its nose to pitch up more than expected. At first, it seemed like a minor quirk. It didn't feel dangerous, and it was something pilots could easily handle with manual input, but, as with many things in aviation, even something that feels small can spiral into something far more serious, and in this case, tragically so. This nose-up tendency wasn't just a random design imperfection. It was the result of a much deeper aerodynamic change that stemmed from major modifications to the aircraft's engines and flight systems. Boeing had added new engines, and to make those changes manageable without redesigning the entire plane, they created a system called MCAS to help smooth out the MAX's new flight behavior. The system was intended to be unobtrusive, barely noticeable, but it turned out to be far more influential and dangerous than anyone outside Boeing realized. The story of how this all came to be starts with a decision Boeing made under pressure. Airbus had introduced the A320neos, a highly efficient update to its popular narrow-body line, and it was selling fast. Boeing needed a competitive response, but instead of building a brand new aircraft from scratch, which would take years, they decided to modify the existing 737 airframe. The result was the 737 MAX, an updated model that kept the core structure of the 737 NG, but swapped in newer, more efficient CFM LEAP-1B engines. These new engines brought clear benefits. They burned less fuel and emitted less CO2, which appealed to airlines. But there was one problem. These engines were bigger than their predecessors. The 737's design sits relatively low to the ground, and there wasn't enough room under the wing to fit the new engines in their original position. So, Boeing moved them slightly forward and higher up, closer to the wing's leading edge. That relocation, while visually subtle, changed how the plane behaved in the air. In certain conditions, especially during high angles of attack or strong thrust settings, the repositioned engine nacelles began generating additional lift. Think of the nacelles as unintentionally acting like small wings. They were now in a place where they could contribute extra upward force at the front of the aircraft. The result? The nose started pitching upward, even without the pilot's input. This behavior had nothing to do with weight distribution, as many people initially assumed. It wasn't that the new engines were heavier and pulled the nose up. It was the lift they produced in flight. And because the engines sat higher and farther forward than before, the force they generated pushed against the aircraft's balance. At certain moments, like takeoff or steep climbing turns, that push could create an unstable pitch-up tendency. MIT aeronautics professor R. John Hansman explained it clearly in an interview with Forbes. As I understand it, at high angles of attack, the nacelles, which are the tube-shaped structures around the fans, create aerodynamic lift. Because the engines are further forward, the lift tends to push the nose up, causing the angle of attack to increase further. This reinforces itself and results in a pitch-up tendency which, if not corrected, can result in a stall. This is called an unstable or divergent condition. It should be noted that many high-performance aircraft have this tendency, but it is not acceptable in transport category aircraft where there is a requirement that the aircraft is stable and returns to a steady condition if no forces are applied to the controls. The unsettling truth was that this newly introduced instability posed a problem not only for pilots, but also for regulators. If Boeing acknowledged that the MAX flew differently from the 737 NG, it could trigger new training requirements for pilots, an expensive and time-consuming process for airlines. So, instead of changing the engine position or tweaking the airframe further, Boeing went with what seemed like a simpler option. They built a software patch. This system, known as the Maneuvering Characteristics Augmentation System, MCAS, was designed to activate automatically in specific flight conditions, mainly during steep climbs or takeoff rolls, and gently push the nose down to keep the aircraft handling more like the older model. This allowed airlines to operate the MAX without paying for additional simulator time or pilot retraining. However, as development progressed, MCAS was quietly given more authority. It could activate multiple times during a single flight, rely on just one angle of attack AOA sensor, and even override the pilot's input, all without being disclosed in training manuals or discussed in depth with the FAA. These changes would soon prove to be fatal. In October 2018, Lion Air Flight 610 crashed into the Java Sea, and just 5 months later, Ethiopian Airlines Flight 302 went down shortly after takeoff. Together, these accidents claimed 346 lives. Investigators later found that in both cases, MCAS had activated based on faulty AOA readings and forced the nose down again and again, even as the pilot struggled to regain control. With no knowledge that the system even existed, and without the training to override it, the flight crews stood little chance. These tragedies sent shockwaves through the aviation industry. The MAX was grounded worldwide, remaining out of service for nearly 20 months, the longest grounding in US commercial aviation history. During that time, Boeing worked with regulators to redesign MCAS from the ground up. It was now required to use input from 2 AOA sensors instead of 1, could only activate once per event, and crucially, could no longer override a pilot's input. Pilots were also now required to undergo additional simulator training that included detailed instruction on MCAS and how to respond to malfunctions. Before the grounding, MCAS had operated largely behind the scenes, undisclosed in manuals and unchecked by pilots. After the changes, it became fully documented, closely regulated, and far more transparent. MAX pilots now receive mandatory simulator training, and the aircraft has since been recertified not only by the FAA, but also by EASA in Europe, Transport Canada, and ANAC in Brazil. The 737 MAX returned to commercial service in December 2020. It has since logged hundreds of thousands of safe flight hours, and is now considered one of the most rigorously tested aircraft in operation. Yet despite all the fixes, the fundamental design issue, the nose-up tendency, still exists. The difference is, pilots are now fully trained on how to manage it, and the software designed to help them is no longer working in the dark. The MAX story remains a cautionary tale of what can go wrong when business pressures override sound engineering judgment. When Airbus launched the A320neos, Boeing found itself playing catch-up. Instead of building a clean-sheet aircraft, they rushed to modernize an airframe that first flew in the 1960s. To save time and money, they buried a critical handling issue under layers of software that ultimately failed. The result was a crisis that claimed over 300 lives, shook public trust in aviation, and forever altered Boeing's reputation. The MAX's legacy is now a stark reminder. When safety becomes a secondary concern, even the most iconic aircraft can fall from grace.